our job done in a better way. There'll be less finger pointing and there'll be more results. There'll be a change in behavior, which is what we really need, instead of a change in rules, and it'll inspire the confidence of the people of the United States about the kind of job we're doing. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Cochran. As we wait for a senator to speak, the White House says President Obama is meeting with House Speaker John Boehner this hour at the White House. The Associated Press writes that the meeting comes as Mr. Boehner has accused the president of dragging out negotiations on any agreement to avoid a series of tax increases and spending cuts that could come in less than 3 weeks. We'll have some of the Capitol Hill briefings from today about the so-called fiscal cliff as part of our primetime coverage at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN. Here on C-SPAN 2 at 8, remarks from Russian President Vladimir Putin and his recent address to his nation. And over on C-SPAN 3, a look at threats to the U.S. infrastructure from the American Bar Association. Representative Tom Reed saying there in a tweet, "Our motivation as we work toward a fiscal cliff solution is our children and grandchildren." We'll continue our coverage of the fiscal cliff on tomorrow morning's Washington Journal. IRS National Taxpayer Advocate Nina Olson will be on the program with what the fiscal cliff means for tax filing season. Also, Washington Post health care reporter Sarah Cliff on what would happen to the doc fix if the country goes over the fiscal cliff. You can see Washington Journal every morning starting at 7 Eastern on C-SPAN.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington,
Mr. President, I ask the quorum call be dispensed with.
without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to say what an important day it is for the U.S. Coast Guard. Our communities who benefit from those services, the men and women who answer the call to serve. The reason I say that is because we have passed a bill that gives 40,000 active duty Coast Guard members the support they need. It is a worthy tribute to a force of men and women that in 2000 alone helped us save over 3,800 lives across the U.S., confiscated over 166,000 pounds of cocaine, and secured over 472 vessels before they arrived at our ports. This legislation will give the Coast Guard the funds that it needs to upgrade equipment and purchase the right vessels for carrying out every mission that they need. This kind of work exemplifies the heroes like Chief Petty Officer Terrell Horn of California. Officer Horn died in the line of duty last week while chasing drug smugglers off the coast of California. Our thoughts are with his family and friends. His actions and service remind us of the danger that the tasks of the men and women of the Coast Guard do on a daily basis. And that's why it was so important that we passed this reauthorization bill. We couldn't have done this reauthorization without the many hours that Senator Begich put in to help it get across the finish line. And he knows how important the Coast Guard is to the men and women of the Pacific Northwest and to my state of Washington. The Coast Guard is part of our maritime culture in the Pacific Northwest, and this bill helps the Coast Guard watch over our people and our businesses and protect our coastline. And in there, I'd like to offer or expound on three provisions that were particularly helpful for us in the Northwest. One, this legislation helps protect the Polar Sea, an icebreaker based in Seattle. It helps us clean up tsunami debris that is already hitting the West Coast. And it analyzes the potential of a tar sand supertanker in our waters off of Washington State. In October of this year, I visited Vigor shipyards in Seattle, where our heavy-duty icebreaker fleet is currently serviced. These ships are a testament to America's shipbuilding prowess and ingenuity. And inspecting them close up, you see that they are almost a critical tool for the United States in our economic security and national security when it comes to the Arctic. You see that the icebreakers mean jobs to Washington State, and that's why in this final package, the importance of these ships, these icebreakers, the Polar Sea, was in danger of being scrapped. There is no denying that we need to build a new icebreaker fleet for the future and for our Navy Arctic mission. But these specialized vessels will take up to 10 years to build. So in the meantime, we want to make sure that U.S. companies can continue to do business and keep the Arctic operational and running. And so it's very fitting that the icebreakers that work fine now are not dismantled. So this legislation prevents them from being scrapped and helps us have the resources that we need to serve interests in the Arctic. This bill stipulates that we won't junk our current icebreakers, and it's more cost-effective to keep them. And it will make sure that they stay seaworthy so that the crews don't go out on faulty equipment. These ships won't go away unless it can be proven that it makes financial sense to replace them. Last January, the world watched as the Healy icebreaker successfully cut through a path in the Arctic Sea to deliver fuel to Nome, Alaska. The Healy is primarily a research vessel, but was forced to do the job because our two heavy-duty icebreakers were not currently in active status. They were being repaired. So this bill ensures that the polar icebreaking fleet will continue to be based in Seattle, and that refurbishing these icebreakers like the Polar Sea, which roughly take about 5 years and employ 300 workers, will continue to move forward. For us, this means shipbuilding jobs. It means an impact of keeping smaller shipyards in Washington State busy, and it means keeping icebreakers that help save places like Nome, Alaska, and help us cut paths through the ice when needed. But that's not the only thing in this legislation I'm proud that we got a decision on. Also, our economy in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii has been threatened by hundreds of thousands of tons of debris washing ashore from the tragic tsunami in Japan nearly 2 years ago. That's why this legislation asks NOAA to take a closer look at the tsunami debris and make sure we are putting an accurate assessment and risk in place to protect the West Coast. If they decide that it is a severe marine debris event, then they will need to present a specific coordination plan developed to meet that threat and work with local governments, counties, and tribes, and to make sure that there is a coordinated effort to protect our economy and environment from tsunami debris. We know in the Northwest, because we have already seen ships, we've seen bridges, we've seen various parts float ashore, oftentimes local communities having to share the burden and expense of cleaning up the tsunami debris. With over 165,000 jobs and nearly $11 billion in our coastal economy, from fishing to tourism to various activities, we want to make sure that tsunami debris does not hurt our coastal economies. All you need to do is ask the mayor of Long Beach, who said, quote, "An uncoordinated and unmanaged response to debris events is a blow to Long Beach and the Columbia Pacific region, and we cannot endure," end quote. This is about getting a plan in place for local communities to coordinate, to have opportunities to work together, and to remove debris as cost-effectively as possible. And third, Mr. President, this legislation has important language protecting Washington waterways and very precious parts of the Pacific Northwest. Recently, Canada announced that over the next decade, they would double the production of the Alberta tar sands and oil fields. That could be 15 billion gallons of oil already shipped through Washington waters and an increase. A spill in a heavily populated area or in the waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca could cause billions of dollars of damage and harm businesses throughout the region. The response can't be, even if the spill occurs in Canadian waters, don't worry, just call the Americans. I'm proud that this legislation looks at the potential threat caused by supertankers and whether they are equipped to respond to the spill that would occur from corrosive tar sand oil. Thanks to this legislation, the Coast Guard will have to prepare a study, analyze how much vessel traffic increase would be seen in the region due to tar sand increases, and whether that movement of tar sand would require navigating through fragile waters, and what an oil response plan capability in U.S. and Canadian waters would be as a shared response. They need to identify the tools needed to clean up this kind of an oil spill and estimate the cost and benefits to the public of moving this oil through international waterways. This assessment has to be complete in 180 days. So, Mr. President, I want to make sure our fishing fleet, our restaurants, our resort economy, everything that is so important to us in the Northwest is protected. This legislation is good news for coastal communities, for jobs in Washington State and across our country. And I'd like to thank both the chair and the ranking member of the subcommittee and full committee for making sure that we have given the Coast Guard the resources it needs to protect our economy, keep our public safe, and protect our environment. We have much more work to do, but in a Congress when we're down to our waning days of this Congress, it's important that this legislation has passed and is on its way to the President's desk. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alabama.
something special happened earlier today, and it's an important principle is being established in the Senate. And that principle is that we will adhere to the budget agreement that we made with the American people 16 months ago. In other words, we agreed in at least certain of our counts to have a limit on spending. It's an increase every year, over 10 years, it increases, but not as much as it was being increased. And we agreed that would be the limit, and we would not spend more than that. We've had 4 consecutive bills brought to the floor of this Senate, cavalierly, I would suggest, directly in violation of the spending limits that we agreed to just a little over a year ago. As a result, I or some other member of the Senate has made a budget point of order. That budget point of order said that the legislation before us violates the budget, it spends too much, and that we object. At that point, our Democratic leadership each time moved to waive the budget, forget the budget, spend above the budget, don't worry about the budget, just spend the money because this is a good bill. It's got good proposals, and anybody that opposes it is against these good proposals. Waive the budget. And so we've now had 4 votes, and in all 4 of those votes, the Senate has said, no, we're not going to waive the budget. We're going to live within the agreement of spending we reached just last year. And there's no reason this bill that's before us couldn't have been brought in within the budget. And indeed, there has been no reason they shouldn't be within the budget. Some were not over the budget spending much. But we have got to adhere to that principle. And I've been very proud that members of this Senate, sufficient numbers, have said no. We're going to honor the promise we made to the American people, and we're going to do that. And we're not going to bust the budget. So I think it's sending a message, and the message needs to be received. So initially, the spin in this body has been, oh, Senator Sessions and his objectors don't want any good legislation to pass. They're just using the Budget Act to block it. But I think we're changing that now, and I think the American people are going to see what's happened. And we've had probably 7 votes on the budget. The last 4 have been won. And I think the American people are going to start asking, why were you, Senator, voting to waive the budget every single time? Didn't you agree to certain spending limits? Why did every time a bill come up you vote to spend more than you agreed to spend? Spend more than you told us you were going to spend? I think that's what ought to be the message coming out of here, and I would just go a little further. If somebody wants to have legislation passed, don't blame the people who raised the budget point of order. Blame yourself if you don't bring it to the floor in a paid-for way that does not violate the budget. That's important. I think that's being established now. And that's what I think we should expect of anyone that wants to move legislation in the United States Senate. If you want it to get the vote and be passed, be sure you comply with the agreement that we made. And what agreement was that? If you remember, 16 months ago in August, the debt limit had been reached. And it was put off and delayed, and we got to the very last. And they reached this secret agreement, not publicly like it should have been, but we reached an agreement. And it had at least some limits on spending. I didn't like the way it was done, but it did propose certain limits. It exempted totally Medicare, exempted food stamps, Medicaid was totally exempted from any cuts, but other parts of the budget were controlled, had their spending levels controlled by the budget. And as a result, that was passed, and the debt ceiling, the limit on the amount of money that can be borrowed by the United States government was raised $2.1 trillion, because we're now borrowing about 40 cents of every dollar that we spend, and we have a limit by the Congress, as the Constitution provides, on how much you can borrow, how much the President and the executive branch, the United States government, can borrow. And we reached that limit, and spending was going to drop 40%, or maybe right across the board, perhaps. And so we raised it so we could continue to borrow. But the promise was that over 10 years, the level of spending would be reduced by that amount. So we raised the debt limit, $2.1 trillion. Spending was promised to be reduced over the next 10 years by $10 trillion. Now we've already spent that $2.1 trillion. I hate to tell you, but by January, February, we're going to be right back into this body dealing with the question where we hit the debt limit again. This year, it looks like we'll have another deficit well over $1 trillion. And in fact, the first 2 months of this calendar year were extraordinarily bad. Almost $300 billion in debt in the first 2 years. At this rate, the deficit would be the largest ever in the history of the Republic. So something needs to be done about that, and we did make that change, and for us to go back on that and not follow the budget agreement, before the ink is dry on it, before 1 year is gone, we're bringing up bills that violate that amendment. If we were to continue in that path, American people would have a right to have no confidence in us and to wonder what it is. You promised us you were going to reduce the growth of spending, and as soon as the shoe starts getting a little tight or the belt starts squeezing, you cut and run, senators. So far, at least in recent weeks, we've been doing rather well on this path of saying we will adhere to the budget agreement. We've had, I think, on each one of the votes, some Democratic support, one, but mostly the Republicans have been the ones that have held to the budget, and we've had 1 or 2 Democrats vote with us, I think, on each one of those votes. Now, why and where are we today? We're talking about the fiscal cliff. And the President campaigned around this country, and he said, I've got a balanced plan. And that balanced plan is going to have so much in spending cuts and so much in tax increases, and it needs to be balanced. And you Republicans, we've got to have more tax increases. Our country needs to get itself on a sound financial path. And I've got a deficit reduction plan. And he ran an ad. He ran an ad in the last months of this campaign that said, I have a plan to pay down the debt. And earlier this year, his budget director came before the committee and would not disavow the claim that the President has a plan to pay down the debt. And I would just say that that is one of the greatest financial misrepresentations ever, that the President of the United States would tell the American people, don't worry, elect me, I've got a plan to pay down the debt, when he has no such plan, nothing close to it. Under the score of the Congressional Budget Office, over the next 10 years, we will add almost $9 trillion. We will add $9 trillion in debt of the United States. Add $9 trillion more dollars. That's almost $1 trillion a year for 10 years on average. It goes down some in the mid-years, but in years 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, the deficits are going up every year. They'll average almost $1 trillion a year. So that's what I thought the President was talking about, and I think the American people felt he was talking about when he said, I want a plan that'll pay down the debt, and I'm going to raise taxes, and we're going to pay down the debt. And we'll have spending cuts also. Well, what is it that we now know about that plan? This is the essence of it, that Secretary Geithner, the Secretary of the Treasury, met with, I guess, Speaker Boehner, and this is an outline of the President's deficit reduction plan. This is what they are proposing to do. They started off a few weeks ago at $1.6 trillion in new taxes. Now we're talking about $1.4 trillion, I understand. That's the latest iteration of the tax increases, $1,400 billion in tax increase. Well, where will that money go? And will it change the debt course of America? Will it put us on a sound path? Can we go home at night and say, wow, I'm glad they finally got their act together and put this business on the road? Well, let's examine what they're proposing. They're proposing to spend above the BCA, the Budget Control Act limits that I just talked about. They have certain limits, includes a sequester. Those limits are in law. The law will have to be changed, and if a president proposes to change the law, and to eliminate $1,200 billion of those cuts. $1.2 trillion off the table. That's 60% of the cuts that were agreed to when we raised the debt ceiling $2.1 trillion. Wipe out 60% of them just like that. That is new spending above the law in effect today, eliminating the caps that I just mentioned. In addition to that, he has no funds to pay for the doc fix. We call it the doc fix, but the physicians are being, if we don't fix this, they will have a 25% or so cut in their reimbursement rates for doing Medicare work. And many of them, it's half of the work that they do. $400 billion. No money for that. That'll be added to the debt in scores. The Social Security holiday, so that'll have to be spent. The Social Security contribution holiday, you don't pay as much into Social Security as you did. The U.S. Treasury has to borrow that money and put it in the Social Security Trust Fund because people aren't paying it off their withholding check. So that's another $110 billion. They want to spend $50 billion more on transportation issues and $30 billion more on unemployment insurance extension, totaling $1,790 in new spending. Do they have any reduction in spending? Yes. They're talking about $400 billion in mandatory spending. Most of that apparently would be reducing, or maybe 300 of it, payments to providers in Medicare and Medicaid. Providers, that's your doctor and your hospital. Cut them some more. They've already cut deeply when Obamacare was passed. Whether that would ever stick or not, I have my doubts. So that would say that the new spending is $1,390 billion, $1.39 trillion. And the taxes, $1,400 billion. So we're on a path today, under the current baseline of spending under the Budget Control Act, of increasing the debt $9 trillion. Under the President's plan, whereby he raises taxes $1.4 trillion, we would have added to the debt $8,990 billion. So what does this mean? It means that we're going to have a major tax increase and new spending. No net cut in spending, but a major new increase in spending of $1.39 trillion. Now that's a fact. And it's a very troubling fact. And I'd add one more thing. See, my colleague is here, that I believe the President of the United States should not lull the American people into believing that somehow he's got a plan that's going to pay down our debt or get us on a sound financial course. He has one goal, it seems to me, to raise taxes and raise spending. That's exactly what this plan does. It has no reform on Medicare, Social Security, or Medicaid, or food stamps, some of the fastest growing entitlement programs that we have, big ones. No plans to fix any of that in any serious way. Refuses to talk about that, saying anybody that talks about that just doesn't like old people and doesn't care about America. We need some leadership. We need some honesty. We need a President of the United States who will look the American people in the eye and explain to them that we are living beyond our means. We do not have the money to continue to borrow 40 cents of every dollar that we spend. We cannot continue on this path, as expert after expert has told us. So I would just say I'm proud that, again today, this Senate, at least a good solid minority, stood firm, I think 44, and said, no, we're not going to waive the budget. We're going to stand by the limits on spending that were part of the Budget Control Act. But I'm not pleased that this whole process that's going on with Speaker Boehner right now and the President it looks like it's not likely to lead to any changes in our debt course. Even after raising taxes, if the President had his way, $1.4 trillion. We'll still be on basically the same debt course. How could we allow this opportunity to get away from us? Going to raise taxes big time, and it's still not going to use any of it, in effect, to pay down debt and reduce, look, not pay down debt. There's no plan in the remotest future that we would ever pay down our debt. The question is, will we reduce the annual deficits that will average almost $1 trillion a year for the next 10 years and get worse in the outer years? Why don't we've got to deal with that. There's no escape to it. There's no way you can get around it. Any mature person who loves this country knows we've got to confront it, and it can't just be done by raising taxes. We're going to have to reduce spending in this country. It's not going to hammer the economy. We don't have to throw people in the streets, but we need a sustained effort to reduce the growth in spending in this country. And if we just do that, we'd surprise ourselves that we could get on a sound course before too many years. I thank the chair would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I came here to the floor to talk about Medicare. My esteemed colleague from Alabama just talked about Medicare reform. You and I, all of us pay in to Medicare every month, and so we are entitled to Medicare benefits when we reach age 65. The fact that we are entitled to these benefits is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing for so many millions of American seniors. And the fact that many call it an entitlement only means that we have a right to expect to get the benefits we paid in for. Entitlements, in this case, should not be a pejorative. We've heard a lot about entitlement programs recently and about the place of Medicare in the conversation about our federal deficit. We just heard the senator from Alabama talk about that. And he said there's no discussion of reform of Medicare. But sometimes in these discussions, sometimes I think a critical component is missing, which is that we already reformed Medicare. And these reforms extended the life of Medicare by 8 years, while expanding benefits for seniors. During the recent campaign, as the presiding officer has pointed out, we saw a lot of ads about the so-called $716 billion in cuts to Medicare and how terrible that was, is, and will be. Well, I'd really like to take just a few minutes to explain what these savings are, what they were and what they are and what they will be. The two biggest sources of the $716 billion were, one, ending the overcharging that insurance companies overcharge the government for Medicare Advantage, and the second is savings in payments to hospitals. First, Medicare Advantage. Now, as the presiding officer knows, as people watching no doubt know, that seniors can choose to get their Medicare benefits directly from the Medicare program or to get them through a private insurance program that gets paid by Medicare, which is called Medicare Advantage. Well, before we passed the Affordable Care Act, we were overpaying those private insurers by 14%. These insurers were getting much more than they should have based on the benefits they were providing to seniors. So we cut what Medicare gives to these private insurance companies. That was, over the next 10 years, we are going to cut these insurance payments by 14%, which CBO scored in 2010 as saving Medicare $136 billion over 10 years. And we were told by some of our colleagues that insurance companies were going to leave the market, that we weren't going to have Medicare Advantage anymore. Well, so far, enrollment in Medicare Advantage has gone up by 11%. So this is many, many billions of dollars that we are able to take, instead of overpaying insurance companies, that we're able to take it and extend the life of Medicare. Now, second is the lower in reimbursements to hospitals. Now, why does this work out for hospitals? Well, when you insure 31 million more people, when those 31 million people go to the emergency room, go to the hospital is no longer on line to pay for that. They're not left holding the bag. When those 31 million people now have insurance that pays for it. So the hospitals are now able to take lower reimbursements for Medicare patients. That's why it works out for them. So when people talk about the $716 billion, this is a huge part of what they're talking about. It's not cuts to benefits. It's not shifting costs to seniors. It's streamlining the program and making it more efficient. We took these savings and we reinvested the money in the program, which overall extended the life of Medicare by 8 years. That is entitlement reform. Extending the life of the program. That's what we're talking about when we talk about reforming Medicare. And that is what we did. And not only that, but we actually expanded benefits for seniors. Now, I go to a lot of senior centers around Minnesota, nursing homes. And I got to tell you, the seniors are very happy that we expanded their benefits. They're happy about the new free preventive care that they get. Wellness checkups, colonoscopies, mammograms. They know an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This saves us all money and keeps people healthier. And what else we're doing with this money in addition to, expanding the solvency by 8 years, we're closing the donut hole, the prescription drug donut hole. And I have to tell you, seniors are very happy about that, too. For more than one-third of seniors, for them, Social Security provides more than 90% of their income. For 1/4 of elderly beneficiaries, Social Security is the sole source of retirement income. So when they hit their donut hole, that is serious. And sometimes they have to make choices between food and heat and medicine. And because we're closing the donut hole, in many cases, people don't have to make that choice anymore. This is important stuff. When I was running for the Senate, a nurse who worked in Cambridge, Minnesota, town north of the Twin Cities, she came to me and she told me that in the hospital she worked in, very often they would admit a senior who was very sick, and the doctors would treat this senior and get them back on their feet and send them out, send them home with their prescriptions. And as this started happening, they would call the drugstore, the pharmacy, a few days later, a week later, and say, is Mrs. Johnson, has she filled these prescriptions? And the pharmacist would say no, because she was in her donut hole. Well, a couple weeks later, Mrs. Johnson would be back in the hospital. How wasteful is that? Why is that? That costs a tremendous amount of money to our system. This is saving money. This is health care reform. This is Medicare reform. It's improving people's health and saving money at the same time. So we have increased benefits. We've extended the life of Medicare. That was done as part of health care reform. That is Medicare reform. Now, in the election, we had a discussion about this. There were a lot of ads about it. We know what Governor Romney would have done to Medicare. He said very explicitly that, and again, the presiding officer has quoted this. He said very explicitly he would restore those billions and billions of dollars in overpayments to private insurance companies for no reason, for no good effect, just so that, I guess, these insurance companies could have more profit. Instead, we reinvested this money into Medicare. But he would have given it to the insurance companies. He would have replaced the health care law, which would have made the 8 years that we extended Medicare just vanish. Governor Romney supported raising the Medicare eligibility age. But if we raise the age from 65 to 67, as he suggested, that means that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of seniors would no longer have access to Medicare, would end up receiving federal subsidies in the exchanges, and some of them would go to Medicaid. And they would be, the 65 to 67-year-olds would be, by definition, older, and as a population, sicker than the other people in the exchanges and in Medicaid. So they would make both of the programs more expensive. They'd also make Medicare more expensive because they would be the youngest and least sick to be taken out. So although this sounds like a reasonable compromise, trust me, it is a bad idea. It would cost the health care system twice as much as it would save Medicare. This is exactly the kind of bad idea that explains why we pay twice as much as other developed countries around the world for our health care, and in many, if not all, most cases, with worse outcomes. Medicare reform was an issue in the campaign because we already did it. We extended the program by 8 years. And it's not like it was a secret. It was part of the conversation during the election. And in the election, the American people voted to keep those reforms. So as we continue this conversation about our fiscal future, I would love to hear from my colleagues across the aisle about how they would reform Medicare, how they would expand its life by 8 years while expanding, or at least, at the very least, not cutting benefits. How would they do it? Because we extended its life for 8 years and increased benefits, very meaningful benefits. And I would ask my colleagues why, before the election, and this is the very point that the presiding officer from Vermont made just a few days ago on this floor, why they were attacking us, incorrectly, I might add, inaccurately, for making cuts in Medicare. But since the election, they've been insisting that we make cuts to Medicare. So going forward, I just think we need to move from talking points to taking a thoughtful look at policy and working together to tackle our nation's fiscal challenges, and do it based on a little bit deeper look at what we've done and what the health care reform that we passed here in the Senate and in the House and is now the law of the land, what that does. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, with the close of the 112th Congress, the Senate will lose its most determined champion of fiscal prudence and balance, Senator Kent Conrad of North Dakota. Senator Conrad is best known nationally for his leadership as chairman of the Committee on the Budget. Now, again, that committee has limited legislative power, but that didn't stop Senator Conrad from using that committee relentlessly for fiscal restraint, for honest budgeting. As we all know, he has spent countless hours here on the floor educating, exhorting senators on budget issues, driving home his points by displaying a seemingly endless array of charts and graphs. Indeed, I would note that in 2001, the Committee on Rules and Administration assigned Senator Conrad his own printing equipment because he was producing more charts than all of his colleagues combined. The other day, we had this so-called Secret Santa that Senator Franken had established here, in which we draw names out of a hat and we exchange these little gifts here. And you never know who's going to give you a gift. You know who you're giving to, but you don't know who's giving to you. Well, it turned out that my gift giver was Senator Conrad. So I got a nice little book, but most importantly, I got 3 charts. and they were charts from the 2008 Farm Bill. that we'd both worked on and which I was chairman of at that time. And I just thought that was a great gift, both to get some of his charts, but the charts pertaining to a major piece of legislation that both he and I had worked very closely on, because we've been longtime colleagues on the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. He joined that committee as a freshman senator in 1987, just 2 years after I got here in 1985. And we were in the midst of the worst economic crisis in the farm sector since the Great Depression. And Senator Conrad left a major imprint on the Agricultural Credit Act of 1987, advocating strongly for measures to help farm families and rural communities persevere through circumstances beyond their control, to preserve a family farm system of agriculture, as well as to preserve small towns in the fabric of rural America. Over the years, Senator Conrad has been a key advocate in enacting major drought relief bills and other disaster assistance. And he has consistently fought for effective programs to protect and enhance farm income through the farm commodity programs and crop insurance. For many years, we have been allies in advancing farm bill initiatives to promote renewable energy production on farms and in rural communities. And let no one doubt that Senator Conrad has always been a relentless, fierce advocate for the interests of his constituents in North Dakota. I know that Kent is very proud of a framed resolution presented to him by his state's Standing Rock Sioux tribe. It bears his honorary Sioux name, Nomni Snee, which translates as never turns back. I think that really describes Kent Conrad. He never turns back. So, Mr. President, Kent Conrad and I are proud of our shared roots in the upper Midwest. He has been an outstanding senator, a good friend for more than 2.5 decades in this body. I join with the entire Senate family in wishing Kent and Lucy all the best in the years ahead. And also, Mr. President, in these closing weeks of the 112th Congress, the Senate is, as I've said, is saying farewell to a number of retiring colleagues. One of our most poignant farewells is to a member respected and esteemed on both sides of the aisle. I speak of Senator Dick Lugar of Indiana. He is a friend, a fellow Midwesterner, but to all of us he is much more. Dick Lugar is really a senator's senator. He epitomizes the very best in this institution. And it is a sad commentary on the state of our nation's politics that the main reason why Senator Lugar is leaving the Senate is because his primary opponent attacked him for the very qualities we admire and need here: his readiness to forge fair and honorable compromises, his insistence on putting country ahead of party or ideology, his enormous decency and civility. As we all know, Senator Lugar has been the Senate's most passionate and effective advocate of arms control and nuclear nonproliferation. The program he created with former Senator Sam Nunn has assisted Russian and other countries of the former Soviet Union to secure and dispose of their weapons of mass destruction. What an amazing accomplishment by Senator Lugar. I also want to salute Senator Lugar's record of principled, conscientious leadership on the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, including as chairman from 1995 to 2001. He is a key author of landmark measures strengthening federal agricultural conservation policies and programs, particularly in the 1985 Farm Bill and succeeding farm bills. He has been instrumental in strengthening and in fighting at critical junctures to maintain federal nutrition assistance, including school lunch and breakfast and other child nutrition programs, through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and through his support for food banks and other emergency food assistance. Dick Lugar has also been an outstanding leader in enacting federal initiatives to research, develop, and market farm and forest commodities by converting them to energy and bio-based products. For me, it has been a great honor to be Senator Lugar's friend and colleague for 36 years and to serve all that time with him on the Agriculture Committee. Our friendship, of course, will continue. But I will miss, and we will all miss, Senator Lugar's calm, positive, always constructive influence on this body. Across 36 years of distinguished service, this senator and statesman has faithfully served the people of Indiana and the United States, and there's no doubt that he will pursue new avenues of public service in retirement. So I will miss his day-to-day friendship and his counsel here in the Senate. And I wish Dick and his wonderful wife, Shar, all the best in the years ahead. And finally for today, Mr. President, we're bidding farewell to one of our most respected and beloved members, Senator Daniel Akaka of Hawaii, or as we all know him as Danny. With his retirement, our friend is bringing to a close a remarkable and distinguished career in public service spanning nearly 7 decades. Having witnessed as a 17-year-old boy the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he took a civilian job with the Army Corps of Engineers before joining the United States Army in 1945. We honor him, along with his senior colleague from Hawaii, Senator Inouye, and Senator Lautenberg, as the only veterans of World War II still serving in the Senate. Not surprisingly, Senator Akaka has been a leader on veterans issues. He served as chairman of the Committee on Veterans Affairs in the 110th and 111th Congresses, and he remained active on that committee despite relinquishing his chairmanship in the current Congress in order to chair the Committee on Indian Affairs. We will not soon forget Senator Akaka's retort when another senator was holding up a package of veterans' benefits, demanding that the costs of the veterans' benefits be offset. Senator Akaka calmly, very deliberately argued that the costs did not need an offset because, and here I quote, "The price has already been paid many times over by the service of the brave men and women who wore our nation's uniform," end quote. Needless to say, Senator Akaka carried the day. Senator Akaka has played a leading role in demanding improvements in the handling of post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injuries sustained by servicemen and women. And in 2009, he joined with Senator Inouye in securing compensation for Filipino veterans of World War II who fought for the United States. Senator Akaka is the only ethnic Native Hawaiian to serve in this body. Throughout his congressional career, including 4 years in the House and 22 years in the Senate, he has been a determined and passionate advocate for the people of his state of Hawaii. He has fought for legislation that would grant federal recognition to ethnic Native Hawaiians, the same recognition we have granted to American Indians and Native Alaskans. In 1993, President Clinton signed a resolution sponsored by Senator Akaka, officially apologizing on behalf of the United States government for overthrowing Hawaii's last monarch a century earlier. Mr. President, in so many ways, Senator Akaka represents the Senate at its very best, the way it used to be in less partisan times. He works tirelessly behind the scenes. He shuns the media limelight. He prides himself on reaching across the aisle and forging honorable compromises. He is the ultimate gentleman, and his word is his bond. Mr. President, across the many years, Danny Akaka has been a wonderful friend and colleague. And of course, that friendship will continue, but I will miss him here in the Senate. And I join with the entire Senate family in wishing Danny and Millie all the best in the years ahead. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call